Hello. Today we'll be talking about sight, but probably not the sort of sight that you will think of at first mention of the word. There's sight as in seeing with our eyes, and then there's sight as in seeing profound truths and wisdom, and we'll get to that in a moment. But to frame our discussion, the passage we'll be considering today is found in Mark chapter 10, verses 46 through 52. And it reads, "They came to Jericho. As he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, 'Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me.' Many sternly ordered him to be quiet. But he cried out even more loudly, 'Son of David, have mercy on me.' Jesus stood still and said, 'Call him here.' And they called the blind man, saying to him, 'Take heart, get up, he is calling you.' So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, 'What do you want me to do for you?' The blind man said to him, 'My teacher, let me see again.' Jesus said to him, 'Go, your faith has made you well.' Immediately he regained his sight and followed him along the way." The colloquial phrase, "I see," said the blind man, is meant to be ironic. It's meant to convey the idea that the blind person who claims to see is mistaken or perhaps ignorant of their inability to perceive their situation correctly. Miss the forest for the trees, that kind of thing. But if one gives it a little more thought, the saying can be found to contain some deeper truths. Perhaps there are more ways of seeing than with our eyes. Or to put it another way, perhaps we are all blind in one way or another, and there are others around us who see things differently, or perhaps more clearly. Now, only a very arrogant person would claim that this were not the case, that they didn't have their own blind spots. Have you ever known someone who thought that they were good at something, but only, here's the thing, they weren't? I remember playing basketball with this guy who thought he was good at it, only he couldn't see that he was lousy. He would take shots he shouldn't have taken. He would play with far more confidence than he deserved. And it took me some time to realize that basketball just wasn't my game. It was me. And it took me a long time to see it. But that's basketball. Let's raise the stakes. Have you ever been in community with someone who could not see, much less name the flaws in themselves that were destructive? Destructive not only to themselves, but to those around them. Once, during a confrontation with their spouse, one of them said to the other, "Do you see yourself right now?" And in that moment, that one did not mean go look in a mirror. No. The meaning was, I have caught a glimpse of your soul, and I wish you would see what I have seen. Now, if only there were a healer who could give us sight in the important ways. This story today, the one we just read from Mark chapter 10, is a story about a healer who gives sight. And I'm talking about Jesus, of course. And this is one of just several stories where Jesus heals blind persons specifically. And in Mark's gospel, there are 2 stories about Jesus restoring sight. And we must consider the first and what built up to that moment before we can fully appreciate what is happening in Bartimaeus' case. But first, not to muddy the waters still further, I'd like to bring in a fancy word here, prolepsis. You probably already know this word, but in case you don't, in literature specifically, it's used when the plot of the story leaps ahead in time to give the reader some insight that the characters in the story do not have. So to jump out of literature into the world of movies, I'll cite the movie The Titanic, for instance. It does this pretty well. You know from the beginning that the ship sinks in the end. They give it away. But knowing this from the onset gives the middle parts of the story greater weight and meaning. Being given a glimpse of the future for the observer of the story helps us to make meaning of the middle parts of the story. And understanding where the story is heading gives the words spoken and the actions taken in the middle time greater significance. In the Gospels, Jesus' ministry is filled with moments like this. It is believed that when Jesus healed others, he was providing his disciples proleptic moments, glimpses into their futures when all would be made well. It was believed at that time that the realm of God was coming and would be made manifest on earth as it was in heaven, or as we pray in the Lord's Prayer, your will be done on earth as it was in heaven. And it was believed, it was anticipated that that time would come when earth would resemble the realm of God. And we'll consider next week perhaps one of the clearest examples of this when we read Revelations chapter 21, verses 1 through 6, which read in part, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice saying from the throne, 'See, the home of God is among mortals. God will dwell with them. They will be God's peoples. And God will be with them. God will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away.'" Stuff like that paints a picture for a future when all is set to right. And I ended reading at verse 4. Next week we'll move on and read some more of that. But that's next week. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. The point is, through passages like this, we catch a glimpse of a possible future for humanity and all creation. God and all the peoples of the world and all of the creatures and everything. And these words are meant to serve as a lens through which we can envision a future for the earth, the human race, and everything else that has arrived at a place, a different place, a better place, not a shipwreck, but a place of healing and wholeness and justice and peace. The prophets talk about it again and again. And when Jesus described the realm of God, he was helping the disciples to better see their future for which they could hope and wait for, but also experience in these moments when he healed the sick, the blind, the lame. In those moments, he's bringing the future into the present moment, at least in part. Prolepsis. Again, prolepsis. Paul would say that now we see as though through a glass, darkly, but still we see something. Prolepsis. A glimpse into the future. Biblical scholar Dr. Ron Allen writes of this passage that we're considering from Mark chapter 10 in his excellent book, Preaching the Gospel Without Blaming the Jews, which he co-wrote with the late Dr. Clark Williamson, and I quote, "At one level, the healing of Bartimaeus is a prolepsis of the divine realm. Blind people, such as Bartimaeus, were often reduced to begging. They frequently sat along the road in rags with flies eating the pus running from their eyes. Many Jewish writers anticipate that their eyes would be opened in the realm of God. At another level, however, blindness is sometimes used figuratively of theological imperceptibility. Those who do not understand God are blind. The saved see aright. The story thus speaks figuratively of theological perception. Again, he's talking about blind Bartimaeus' story. End quote there. And sight being evoked in this metaphorical sense happens again and again in the Hebrew Bible. There are numerous instances that I could draw from, but I'll just pick one from Isaiah chapter 59, verses 9 through 10, in which we read, "Therefore justice is far from us, and righteousness does not reach us. We wait for light, and lo, there is darkness, and for brightness, but we walk in gloom. We grope like the blind along a wall, groping like those who have no eyes. We stumble at noon as in the twilight, among the vigorous as though we were dead." And to put those words into context, the prophet is talking about the lack of justice and peace in every good thing in the community. So to paraphrase, my paraphrase, we cannot see our way to justice and peace. Therefore, we are spiritually dead and spiritually blind because we cannot see the ways that lead to justice and peace. Again, if only we had the eyes to see our way out of this mess. Well, disciples of Jesus believe that God can and does give new eyes. As I was saying earlier, today's story is one of two stories in which Jesus heals a blind person. In the first, found back in Mark chapter 8, we read of an unnamed blind man whose sight is restored, but only in stages, not all of a sudden, as in Bartimaeus' case, but in stages. Jesus restores his sight by touching his eyes. After the first touch, the man could see dimly. Then after the second touch, he could see clearly. Now, that raises a question. Why did it take 2 touches? Well, to this question, Dr. Ron Allen writes, "Christian bewilderment over why a second touch was required misses Mark's point. This story figuratively summarizes the limited grasp of the disciples to this point in the second gospel. Like the person at Bethsaida, they have partial awareness of the realm of God. They know it is coming and see its signs, but their vision is hazy." End quote. And I can only say, this is how it's worked in me. Like the blind man in Mark chapter 8, the ways that I see by faith come into focus, but over time. And there is still quite a lot of ambiguity, in fact. For the disciples, the second scale would fall from their eyes, or a second scale would fall from their eyes, giving clearer sight, immediately following the story of the first blind man in Mark chapter 8. Allen writes, and again I quote, "The second touch that the disciples need begins in 8:27 through 9:8, with the news that the coming of the realm of God includes suffering." That's the sight. That's the revelation. Again, quoting, Mark chapter 9, verse 9 through 10:45 portrays the disciples continuing to misunderstand the coming of the realm, thus demonstrating that the second touch is not yet complete. End quote. And I just got to say, boy, don't we know it even now. There's still so much we do not see that we cannot, and in some cases will not comprehend. And at this point, I am overwhelmed by what we cannot see. Fortunately, the story of Bartimaeus' restoration of sight has a narrow enough focus that I think we can grasp at least one form of perception, one thing that we can see today and continue to see after stepping away from the story, perhaps something we did not see clearly before. There is one truth about God and God's love that this story reveals that I think we might just see, or at least better perceive, before we leave this time together. The man caught Jesus' attention by shouting a phrase that is meant to stick out. It's important. "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And from this statement, we can draw 2 things. 1, in naming Jesus, the Son of David, the man was identifying Jesus as the one who was prophesied to bring about the realm of God, the place of justice and peace and every good thing. In short, The blind man believed that here in Jesus was a man who brought God's will and power with him in his person. The second thing we can discern from his cry out to Jesus is that in using the word mercy, he is making a theological claim about Jesus as the manifestation of the love of God and about the very nature of that love itself. Let me say more. The word here translated as mercy comes from a Greek word which was then used to translate a Hebrew word which is hesed. I know it seems garbled, so if you don't follow me, basically it's this. English mercy from the Greek, and then the Greek back to Hebrew is this word hesed, which is used time and time again in the Hebrew Bible to describe God's steadfast love or covenantal loyalty with us. It is a word that describes not our love for God or our faithfulness to God, but God's love for us always and forever. And in English, the word is sometimes translated in different ways depending on the context, as mercy, kindness, loving kindness, or simply as goodness, God's goodness towards us, but at such a magnitude that nothing can/will separate you from this love, this mercy, this goodness. God will be ever faithful and merciful to humanity and creation, and this theme comes through again and again. So back to our man, Bartimaeus. Here we have an image of a man shouting at Jesus, "Show me this love, this hesed. I believe that it's there. I may be blind, but I can see that it's there. Jesus, Son of David, show me the realm of God. Show me God's love, God's mercy, God's endless kindness that I know is there. I see it in you." This man was not so blind to have not seen these things in Jesus. Those around him could not see it. Did you notice how the story goes? They, the others around him, sternly ordered him to be quiet. Verse 49. But no, he would not. He could see the love of God, hesed, in Jesus, even though the rest of them could not. Well, Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up. He is calling you." So, verse 50, throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. End quote. And I just got to say, one might just as well as say that the man's true spiritual sight, which gave rise to his faith in Jesus, is what restored him. Turns out he wasn't as blind as everyone thought. And here's the point for us. Here's the truth to which I hope we can open our eyes to and see along with Bartimaeus today. God's love and mercy for us and faithfulness to us are just as present as they were for this man. If you are listening to these words right now and wondering if you can be loved, love and mercy are always right there for those who can accept it. Bartimaeus found this, saw this, and followed Jesus along the way. In other words, being a disciple means, in part, accepting the love, mercy, and forgiveness that God has for all of us. That's step one. This is the doorway to our conversion and our redemption and restoration to community. But once you walk through that door, all the journeying really begins, because you'll discover along the way countless others who do not believe in, cannot see the love of God for them. They may be showing in their own way, shouting in their own way, this cry, "Have mercy on me." But who will hear them? Who will see them? And at this point, I gotta say, it's for disciples who have seen the love of God, who are witnesses to the loving works of God in the world through Jesus, to tell those crying for mercy what we've seen. And what we've seen? Well, we've seen the same thing that the Apostle Paul saw, who wrote in Romans chapter 8, starting with verse 38. For I am convinced that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. That's what we've seen. Today we have seen this and have believed it. So sisters and brothers, let's help to open the eyes of others to this love.